So we're here today just to talk about diversity, and we're going to try and lead the conversation away from diversity in the boardroom, in the C-suite, to diversity in the actual workforce itself. We're going to talk about how leaders in companies can actually affect diversity from the top and how it can trickle down into the workforce as well. I've got a great panel with me this afternoon, so I'll be trying to do as little talking as possible and leave my experts to do the majority of the talking. To my left, I have Nancy Dowding, who's the General Counsel of Danone. I have Sam Hicks, Assistant General Counsel at Porsche, and most of you know Vita Richardson, who's the President and CEO of the ACC, the Association of Corporate Counsel. So we've got a pretty vast amount of expertise and experience happy to talk about it. When we talk about diversity, obviously a lot of the focus is about gender diversity, but I just want to be clear for the purposes of this panel that we are talking about race, we are talking about ethnicity, we are talking about sexual orientation and skill set. Although the topics will veer towards gender, we are talking about diversity in the workforce as a whole. So a question for the three of you. Although this is a topic du jour, and everyone seems to be talking about it, we had Women's International Day yesterday, are companies still struggling with diversity?
I would say for Porsche Cars North America, one of the things that we're seeing, we have a tremendous amount of diversity throughout our workforce. I mean, we are in Atlanta, and I think the diversity of the city is reflected in our workforce generally. What we're not seeing, though, is diversity in our executive ranks. I was sharing with Ty before the panel. I had a gentleman come see me on his last day. He came into my office and said, Sam, I'm leaving. One of our competitors moved into town, into Atlanta, and he said, I'm going to that competitor. And I said, wow, why? You know, high performer, you've been here a while, you don't love it. And he said, there's nowhere else for me to go. If you look around, you're the only person of color, of any color, with an office around here, and I want a career. And at that moment, I realized that we had a problem about our perception within the company about where careers can go. And I took that opportunity to go talk to our VP of HR and say, hey, this just happened. Never really dawned on me. Have we thought about how to do that? And so we have some initiatives now starting, but just out of that conversation. So again, workforce wide, we see a lot of diversity, and our management, not really right now.
I would say that from my vantage point at ACC, what I see are organizations that fall along a continuum of one of three stages. The first stage I would call the compliance-focused stage, where an association is more focused on making sure they don't do anything wrong to get sued. And that is, I guess, the lowest form of where you could be on the continuum, with it being compliance, diversity, and then moving to an inclusive stage. So compliance-focused organization tends to just make sure we're not doing anything wrong in terms of how we bring people in or how we exit them out of the organization. I'd say the majority of organizations at this stage have moved beyond just being compliance-focused to most awakening to a diversity-focused stage. And at a diversity-focused stage, you tend to see organizations bringing in diverse groups of people, often at the more entry to mid-level ranks, not achieving very much parity in terms of executive ranks, and having a lot of programs that are more about how do we recruit people, how do we outreach to people, how do we keep them to move them up to a middle rank. That tends to be programs where they have a lot of mentor programs. There are women's initiatives, there are LGBT initiatives. These are all the things that they're doing to demonstrate to a diverse workforce that they're welcome. But the highest level of corporation, and I think the one that most organizations that would come to an Ethisphere conference would aspire to, is to be a more inclusive organization. And when an organization makes that transition from being diversity focused to inclusive, you tend to see more executives at the upper ranks who reflect the diversity, of their employee population. You also see diversity moving to being an issue that's discussed at the board level, not just, an HR help us bring people in sort of issues. So I think that's the continuum, and the goal is to see more corporations move to that inclusive phase, which is really where I think the more ethical companies tend to want to aspire.
So I'm Nancy Dowling. I'm general counsel of the Danone companies in the U.S. And from my perspective, it seems as if diversity became a very big issue, and everyone wanted diversity, but no one was quite sure how to get there and what to measure. So if you look at the compliance focus, and you're looking at just the measurements that the government gives you, which would be maybe race, sex, depends on what area you live in, you've missed out on what a truly diverse workforce would look like. And at the beginning of this, you talked about diversity, and you gave 4 categories.
Yes.
And what were those 4 categories?
Outside of gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and skill set.
Yes. So what about, for example, introverts and extroverts? So what if you're in a very introverted company and you're an extrovert? So are you in or out? And I think as we drill down the idea of what diversity really means, it means respect for the individual and how every individual is different. So we start with race, we start with sex, but then you think about millennial, non-millennial, how fast are you on Excel versus someone who has had Excel, all their lives? Flyover states, that's another thing. I was watching the news program during the Iowa caucuses, and this was on, the local news showed Iowa as in overalls with hay coming out of their mouths, and that's how New Yorkers were depicting people from Iowa. So I think, there was no respect for diversity even within our country there, right? So, I think we have to really talk about inclusion, and if you talk about inclusion and start with inclusion rather than with compliance, then you start talking about respect for the entire human being. And I think that is probably a wiser approach on how you can get to a diverse workforce rather than trying to measure numbers of man versus woman or sex. Certainly that's important. I'm an attorney. You don't want any lawsuits. But at the same time, I don't think you'll reach your goals as a company if all you do is measure compliance as defined by the U.S. government.
No, I would agree. I don't think that you should measure compliance as defined by the U.S. government. That would be at the lowest end.
Yes.
In terms of the diversity continuum. And I'd say that I agree that it's important to have an environment that's respectful. But I don't think we can be blind to the fact that certain sectors, significant sectors of our population, are not well represented at the upper, ranks. And women, minorities, LGBT are just frankly not well represented at the top. And I do see that as a problem that isn't solved by watering down what diversity means, to start thinking about diversity of thought, diversity, of a type, what you wear, and I see that as part of the reason why many organizations end up mired and stuck at the compliance stage, because they're not willing to acknowledge that there are differences that, that do divide us, and that we need to be much more inclusive in terms of the composition of our teams.
I think the lady had a question.
Yes, I was going to Ms. Dowling's comments that, quite frankly, I think that by defining diversity as you have, provides an excuse for corporations not to look at diversity in a more concrete way. I don't think we've reached the point where we have the luxury of looking at diversity as broadly as you define it, because most corporations are just in the, if I use Ms. Richardson's continuum of the diversity stage. And I think it's dangerous to give corporations an excuse to look at diversity and not looking at dealing with issues regarding race and ethnicity and sexual orientation at this point. I just don't think we've gotten to where you are.
I think the issues, if we look at race, it's what race are we looking at? If we look at ethnicity, what ethnicity are we looking at? And, what I'm concerned, what my concern is if we look just at African Americans, then what about the Latinos?
I'm not suggesting that.
Yes,
No,
but
no
what
one
I'm
is.
what I'm saying is what I'm trying to say is that if you look at your workforce as trying to be inclusive, so that no one is judged by the color of their skin or their sexual orientation or whether they're an introvert or an extrovert, but there's respect for the individual within the organization, then you're more likely to get a workforce that is blind to the differences among us and working in concert together.
So what I'm hearing from you and from Nancy is that I think you're talking about a company culture. I think what you're talking about is all of a sudden you are giving companies an excuse not to concentrate on race, not to concentrate on gender, because the company will say, well, we have a whole array of issues to deal with. What about that person? He can't wear a red tie to work in the morning. So are you saying that by looking at too many different variables, you're taking the spotlight off what we should be concentrating on?
Well, I think if we start, I'm Gerald Marker with Northern Trust, if we start to really think about diversity, first of all, as a business imperative, we are all in sectors that the talent race is on, and many of us are losing it.
Yep.
So if we begin to think about diversity by expanding kind of the segmentation, we lose. Because that's not the way the millennials, that's not the way the market is looking at diversity. So for Northern Trust, we have a very healthy set of business resource councils that actually help us outside of, let's have 5 of this and 6 of that, but really let's develop business in these particular markets where there might be some insights into the marketplace. So as we think about developing business, we're not necessarily looking, I suppose if we were in a different business, that might be the case, looking at extroverts versus introverts. But we're looking at the burgeoning African-American market, we're looking at the burgeoning Latino market, we're looking at all of these emerging economies. So the diversity, keeping that diversity definition to what we have historically talked about, which we haven't fixed yet, that helps us to really drive bottom line impact, which is what we have to be thinking about when we're having the diversity and inclusion conversation, because it takes it from a right thing to do to a strategic imperative, which is a very different topic. And I'll just say about the color blindness or the other blindness, I think we have to be very careful as practitioners in the space to say, I don't see color, I don't see orientation, I don't see, because you must see it. And the seeing it is important so that you can understand the value of it within your business. I think that's just a very important comment that I would add.
I think where we're trying to reach, at least in our organization, we've done a lot of training, particularly this is one of the goals of this year, is around inclusion. And I think it is becoming aware how people feel not integrated into the organization. And it could be because there's a lot of extroverts in our organization. And so how does an introvert feel being part of our organization? The same would be true for African American. How would an African American feel being part of the organization? And what is setting someone off to being excluded rather than included? And what are the implicit differences that we're sending out? That who do you go to lunch with is one of the questions we ask. Name the 3 people you go to lunch with most often. And how much do they look exactly or have the same profile that you have, maybe 3 children and a husband? And how much richer of a workplace would we have if we all try to stop, communicating with the same type of people that we are, but reaching out to be more inclusive in our everyday dealings with our colleagues. And I think what we're trying to do is effectuate a change in the culture. And I understand what you're saying, that if there are change that needs to be made in corporate America, and so you start with the compliance focus, but if you feel like you've got the numbers on the compliance focus, how do you build a very inclusive organization where everyone is working together as one? And I think that is, the fantastical ideal that we would all aspire to.
I want to talk a bit more in depth about what Danone's doing there, but I just want to, the young lady had a question.
I just wanted to say that it seems like it can be a both and. I teach a course at Northwestern University in Chicago that deals a lot with diversity and inclusion, and I think we are working adults. So it feels like we're getting a little bit polarized here. Ethisphere, which is sort of ironic for diversity and inclusion. There's a conversation of holding people accountable, and then there's a conversation of, in a speak out culture, your point, Nancy, is correct. In a speak out culture, people that speak out tend to have a certain comfort level in doing so, and other people don't have that comfort level. So in the context of Ethisphere, I would hope we could have both conversations in a spirit of respect for each other. I think both are important.
So you're talking about this culture, and you publicize it very publicly, how you're doing this. How are you getting buy-in globally for this? Because what you're talking about seems so big and seems so, excuse the pun, diverse, and how you're approaching this. How are you getting buy-in globally for this?
Do you want
Yes.
So this is, we have, so one thing I thought that was very interesting, I think it's a very interesting question. First of all, is that it's really a global workforce now. It's not a single country or the U.S. workforce. Particularly, my company is based in Paris, so we are the other. We are the United States. We're not the Parisians. So it's sometimes interesting to come back from it from the perspective of not being the big Goliath in the room, which is the U.S. typically is. We have developed what we call a manifesto at the global level, where we're setting out principles, as we talk today, general principles about the company. And one of those principles is about diversity and inclusion in the workforce. It seems like if you are truly a global workforce, that diversity is inevitable, because you're talking about all these countries all over the world, and you have so many cultures coming together in a single room if you're truly a global and diverse company. And you have to realize not everyone begins with the same framework, cultural framework that you do. And I think that is the beginning of understanding what diversity means. We do have goals about promotion of women. We can show results where we have promoted women, and we measure the promotion of women. We don't necessarily, outside the United States, measure the promotion of African Americans, because that is a singular issue sometimes or more of an issue in the United States than outside of the United States. It's not to say it's not an issue for our U.S. subsidiary, one that we would look at, but it's interesting to try to take all the cultural prejudices you find all over the world and try to build principles that give you a diverse workforce, which I think is a real challenge.
Sam, this is a question for you as well then, because, Porsche being a global company, and Nancy brought up a good point about the fact that, if you're in Japan, you are not going to have an issue with an African-American diversity because it's Japan. However, there will still be a female diversity issue because everywhere you go, 50% of your population will be female. So how does Porsche deal with that? And how does Porsche in Germany look at diversity as opposed to Porsche in Atlanta?
So I apologize in advance because I talk in stories. It's part of what I do.
That's what you're here
part
for.
of compliance training. It is region specific. It is, as to Nancy's point, in Germany, there is a gender issue. There are not a lot of women in engineering in our production facilities. We don't see that. And there's a strong outreach. Porsche AG, our parent company, has a strong outreach program in that regard. And I think I told you on one of our prep calls, first time I went to Germany, about 2 weeks after I'd started with Porsche. Very excited. I'd been in the automotive industry a long time. Accepted this role. And I got there. And throughout my trip, my boss would introduce me and say, "This is Sam, our assistant general counsel." And then she'd say, "Sam, tell them a little bit about your background." So about 5 times after I've explained to people I've been in the automotive industry for a long time, I was with Toyota, blah, 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 I'm going, why do I keep telling people who I am? Why can't I just be Sam? At the end of the conference that we were attending, my boss came to me and said, the general counsel came to me and they're very concerned. They took a poll and they said, "Sam is very quiet. We don't know how she's going to fit in." I'm going, "Quiet? I don't know any." Like, are you serious? I just started. And I cried the whole way home because I thought Porsche was going to be my home. And all of a sudden, I realized I was different. And I have to tell you, to Jerome's point, I don't carry a backpack that says Black woman on it every day. It's a part of my identity, but it's not what's out front. So I had forgotten, for lack of a better description. So I cried the whole way home and didn't understand, came back, did all this research on, African Americans in Germany. I'm going, what in the world? Why? And over time, As I got to know my colleagues in Germany, we have great relationships and we text and it's all fine now. It is a very performance-based culture and I deliver and they're good with that. But initially they were shocked and they did not expect a Black woman in that role. And it was a shock. And now it's fine. In the US, we've taken an approach to make sure that our workforce represents our local area. So Porsche is in Atlanta. We recently moved near the airport. We built a $100 million experience center that we're very proud of. And we required all of our contractors, all of our on-site vendors to recruit in the local community. Our initial diversity targets were related to the community around us. And so our workforce should mirror those. But that's not an issue that they're concerned about in Germany. It really is a gender issue. But that's how we've addressed it so far, being in Atlanta, saying, our workforce needs to look like us. We have really adopted the city that we're in. Our executives do our local plant, make Hapeville beautiful. They do planting. They read in the schools. We've really embraced it. And that's kind of our initial measure. Does our workforce reflect our community?
I will say at ACC, having our workforce reflect our membership was very, very important. When I came in as ACC CEO in 2011, the board was grappling with whether or not the association should continue to pursue its global agenda. And that's because ACC had fits and starts and really wasn't doing very well in creating the global network that the board had envisioned. And one of the things that I believed is that ACC needed to change how it hired and how it reached out to people. So coming in, one of the biggest challenges as CEO was changing a paradigm where at our association, people tended to hire who they knew. And when they hired who they knew, it tended not to be a very diverse group. So we had always had a management structure within ACC that never included people of color. I'm now proud of the fact that of our 9-person executive team, 3 are people of color. We also have LGBT within our executive team as well. The association field is one that's heavily dominated more by women, but not at the executive ranks. Women in the association field tend to be at the middle and more entry level. The majority of my executive team is women. I'm proud of that. I also believe that by creating a more diverse team and also in our outreach, wanting to be global, hiring people who are born, educated outside the United States.
Which I fully endorse, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, when we have an annual meeting, we can have our staff speak in, I think, 16 different languages are represented within our staff. That wasn't always the case. We weren't that sort of welcoming environment. And what our board of directors has seen is that we've eclipsed all of their expectations in terms of global expansion. When I started at ACC, our membership was 28,000. 4 years later, when we incorporated 4,000 members from Australia, we took our membership to 42,000. Wow. That type of growth would not have been possible without the strength of our diverse team and the value that they were able to bring. So when I talk about the value of diversity, I talk from the perspective of someone who's lived it. Now, changing the culture of ACC and the way that we hired came with some pain because I had originally someone who managed human resources that really wasn't for trying to reach out about more diversity, because it made her job a little bit more difficult. But it really, I believe, starts with strong leadership and setting that tone at the top, having the support of a board of directors that is very diverse as well. And one of the challenges that we're having with our board right now, having brought on 6 members of our board, 2 who are in the Middle East, 1 is in Paris, 1 is in Brisbane in Australia. One of our challenges right now is how do we get our board of directors together because they become so diverse time zone wise that it seems like someone's always waking up in the middle of the night in order to participate. But I will say that that has been the biggest success driver for our association. So given that, our board won't turn back in terms of the diversity results.
So you mentioned about internally how ACC is dealing with diversity. You talk to companies every single day, whether they're GCs or government agencies. when does the diversity topic come into conversation? Is it something you try to inject in every conversation you have, or is it something organically that comes to you?
I'm going to be honest that people are not coming to me in this role, having conversations about diversity. I think it's a corporate value of many of the organizations that are a part of ACC. Within our committee, our law department management committee, people share best practices, but I would say that that's not a problem that people come to our association, looking for ready solutions.
Okay.
It's a topic. It's like an important topic, like compliance or anything else, but there isn't a specific diversity set of practices that they're looking to ACC to help them build.
So Nancy and Sam, in your roles as GCs, how many meetings do you have, or do you have regular conversations with your board or your nominating and governance committee around hiring and looking at diverse candidates?
We do, particularly in the United States. You start as Betta was saying, with compliance focus, which is key. If you're the general counsel, you make sure that it makes sense from a compliance focus. But we now have regular conversations and regular trainings for all of our executive team, and then we cascade it down to the rest of the organization around diversity and inclusion topics. We have a number of consultants who have come in and presented to our board, our North American board, on diversity and inclusion topics. We started with diversity. This year we're going to focus on inclusion, and then as a company, some of our brands are brands for young mothers. So we have early life nutrition products, and recently this year, or at the end of last year, we stood up with the Clinton Global Initiative and extended parental leave. And it's not maternity leave, it's for the primary caregiver, and it's 6 months paid. It was a fairly easy sell within my company, because if you go outside of the United States, 6 months paid leave is really the norm. And so to be in a global company and to have a policy where you get 6 weeks unpaid leave for once you have a new baby in the house just didn't seem to the rest of the company like a civilized way to approach a new baby. So
and as the father of a brand new baby who's 3 weeks old, I can certainly attest to that. Yeah. I mean, what I will say, I'm very lucky. Ethisphere has got a great policy on paternity. My boss, Tim Erblick, basically said to me, take whatever time you need. Unfortunately, my baby was born very selfishly just before this conference happened, so I haven't been able to, but it does astound me. I've been living here for 10 years. My wife's American, my kids were born here, but it does astound me how people value maternity and paternity leave so little.
And how this plays into getting women into the top ranks is, I think there's key moments in a woman's career where she may opt out of her career. And one of those key moments is when you have a baby. And so if you have the opportunity to 6 months leave paid so that you can stay home with your baby and know that your job is there when you're ready to go back to the workforce, I think it's a way to keep women in the workforce through childbearing years so that they're gaining experience, and when it's time for the management level positions, you have very experienced women who have kept in the workforce throughout their career and are ready for these higher level management jobs. So,
question, sir.
Yes, Richard Plotkin, Max Secure Foundation. This week in New York, we've heard that Mayor de Blasio is suggesting that transgender persons are able to use the restrooms of their choice, so that men who identify as women will be able to use the ladies' room, and vice versa with women that identify with men. Let me share an experience. My prior life, I was an attorney with a large law firm. A male employee told us that he was going through transgender therapy, and his psychiatrist said that for a year he has to wear dresses and he has to use the ladies' room. So we had a meeting, a number of us male partners, and never have I been in a situation where nobody knew what to say or what to do. Basically, we issued a memo and told him when he could use the ladies' room, and then told all the women when they couldn't use that ladies' room, they had to go to a different floor. And basically, a number of women got together from partners, support staff, associates, and said, we don't really care as long as he puts the toilet seat down. Which I found to be amazing, frankly, where those of us on the other gender were trying to figure out, all right, he applied to us on his application saying he was male. Can that give us grounds to discharge him? So, but as it turned out, I think this is a very important lesson, especially now that Mayor de Blasio is coming out with his dicta, and as a result of the Kate and Jenner experience, it's getting more and more publicity. So I just wanted to share that story if anybody has that experience.
So what I will say is, I think there are certain times, certain events that happen in a company that show you what a company is made of, and decisions have to be made on the spot. And related to that issue, HR came to me one day and said, hey, just realized that our EEO policy in California is different than Atlanta. Do we broaden it, or should we just keep it this way? Because we have some other policies that are different in California related to overtime pay, vacation pay, law specific. And the company had to make a decision. Were we just going to be compliant, or are we going to be inclusive in that moment? And I looked and said, if we have to discuss this, we have a problem. And they changed it. And that was it. And it said gender identity, et cetera. But that was one of those moments where a company has to declare what we stand for. I'll tell you another story, because that's what I do. We had, when we were moving to Hapeville, which is south of Atlanta, and the south of Atlanta has the same kind of negative connotation as the south of everywhere. The south side of Chicago, south central LA, so south of Atlanta. And one of our relatively senior managers was emailing around memes about what our new home was going to look like and what the neighborhood was going to look like. And at the bottom of one of the pictures, there was even the use of the N-word. He claims he didn't see that at the end of the number of pictures that were there, but it went all the way up to the CEO. And at that moment, the CEO had to decide, was it a mistake, or is this who we want? And in that moment, the CEO made an HR decision that if you don't want to come to our new home, if you don't accept our new home, you're not welcome. Have a nice day, sir. So I've been very proud of Porsche to say that when it's come time for us to declare who we are and what we're about, we do it, and we do it the right way. And when we bring it to management's attention, they address it. Now, there are things that are invisible. They're invisible to me. And that story that I just told you about that employee that moved on to another company because of no promotion, just didn't see it. But it's getting addressed. So to your transgender example, we've done it. We actually have non-gender bathrooms, just kind of.
That's it. That's the solution. Yeah. New York restaurants do it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They have non-gender bathrooms. 10 years from now, let's hope we don't have gender bathrooms. Mm-hmm. And then we've solved the problem. So,
transgender people really just want to go potty.
Yeah. And to think
exactly.
And to think they can do it at a certain time, on the same time every day, would be kind of, a little difficult if you ask me.
If you talk to our head of social media, we could just tweet that out. I think that would be just. That would solve everything. I'm just sorry.
On that topic, though, one thing that I think is worth adding is that whenever we have a significant hire at ACC, meaning above a certain level, I interview and speak with them before they get their formal offer. And one of the things that I do is talk about the inclusive nature of our workplace, why it's important, and basically send a signal that if you're not on board with it or you're uncomfortable with how we define our diverse and inclusive workplace, then you really won't be a good fit.
So this was a question for you, Vita, and Sam, and Nancy, and maybe some members of the audience can help as well. So we're talking about putting these controls in place, but who controls the message? Who at your organizations, who is that person?
I and my executive team.
Right.
We just, I'm sorry. No, we just appointed our first woman to the executive committee, and her title is VP of HR, Benefits, Culture, and Innovation. So now we have that seat at the table. So I have a direct link to her, and she brings those issues to the executive committee. I also go to the executive committee on my own as necessary in the compliance function, but that VP role is designed to do that.
So I'm on the executive committee, and I'm in charge of diversity and inclusion, or the sponsor of it for North America. But I would say it's not my responsibility. It's everyone in the organization's responsibility. And it doesn't, it doesn't rest with one person. And if you think that one person can address diversity and inclusion within your whole organization, then I think that you will not get there. I try to inspire, delegate down, have women have committees that address women's issues or LGBT issues within the organization. Get everyone in the organization talking and committed and thinking about these issues. And again, it's a mindset where we will respect each other. And I also think if you're on the executive committee, what does your department look like? You're responsible for your department. And if I'm the head of diversity and inclusion and my department does not look diverse or inclusive, then how can I expect everyone else in my company to understand what the message is I'm delivering? So I think it's important that everyone on the executive committee take individual responsibility for their sphere of influence and make sure it's part of the conversation and the dialogue.
I mean, our legal department is 50% women. It is 50% African American, though the others are myself as an attorney, and then the others are paralegals. But we are actually rather diverse compared to other departments. And I will say, to Nancy's point, I agree that it's everyone's responsibility, but I think at some point, especially for myself and the role that I'm in, I have an obligation to bring it forward. I think that sometimes it doesn't get seen. And so I have the voice, I have the political capital within the company to be able to say the things that maybe other people haven't noticed or can't say. So I do think I have to take that responsibility on. Everybody has to then implement, but somebody's also got to bring up the elephant in the room, and that happens to be me.
I agree with that, but in my role, what I've tried to do is create and foster a culture of diversity and inclusion, and trying to set up means where people feel like they have a voice, and that they're however they identify themselves, that there's room for them in the organization. And if there's support groups or there's women's networks, sometimes it's having kids, not having kids with disabilities. That is a whole nother support group which we have formed within our company, because there's a set of issues there that people need to deal with, and it can be another reason why you might opt out of the workforce. So I think it's a very nuanced conversation that needs to be had in the company.
Yeah, I have some interesting statistics looking at ACC's membership and how it's evolved. Women are now 49.5% of all corporate counsel, and people of color, race, ethnic minorities amount to 17%. In 2011, I think race, ethnic minorities were about 12%. So that's a pretty significant growth, and I think women were at about 45% when I started at ACC. So I think what we're seeing within the in-house counsel community is that by those two measures, we don't have accurate measures regarding LGBT, but at least by those two measures, we're seeing, the landscape for in-house counsel becoming more diverse. In addition to that, when we look at our membership, we've also seen a generational shift in our membership. When I first took over ACC in 2011, baby boomers were the overwhelming majority of ACC's membership. 4 years later, or 5 years later, that's now no longer the case. Generation X and Generation Y are at about 52% of our membership. So baby boomers have moved down, and as the diversity of our membership continues to expand, we've also seen more women moving into the general counsel position. Within Generation X and Generation Y women, there is a higher percentage of women who are GCs of smaller companies than had ever been the case. And it's this group of women that we expect will advance into general counsel role at larger corporations. So we're seeing a shift and a diversification of our entire membership.
You had a question.
It's just sort of an observation, forgive us, something Vita said earlier, which is hire who you know. I mean, that's what happens, and it's one of the things our company does. I'm Melissa Plaskett at Next Era Energy. We have twice yearly diversity summits for managers and above, and it's really focusing on changing how you think about diversity from a business case perspective, which then can lead you concretely into hiring the other, which is the idea that having a mix of viewpoints and a mix of people reflects your customers, brings out-of-the-box thinking, and helps you move forward, and that you need to be able to recognize that if you hire who you know, you're going to end up not reaching into those experiences that you need as a company and as outreach for your community. So it's very powerful to get many people who don't recognize bias to understand that there's unconscious bias, and by calling it out for what it is, helps you rethink about how you're going to approach hiring, how you're going to approach building your team, how you're going to welcome the differing viewpoints.
I mean, we're lucky at Ethisphere. We have a very pro-British person hiring.
Which is excellent, but it gives a value proposition, which sometimes is the way you make change, right? Is if you can say there's a bottom line effect to being diverse, to being inclusive, to being ethical, even though it's the right thing to do, it also puts some dollar and cents to it.
Well, and that's very interesting how I think once you correlate diversity into better business, I think then people start to pay attention. So your question.
And I just wanted to add one thing. One of the things that we do, for better or worse, is we have affinity groups. We have we let employees decide we want to have groups. So we have a Women in Energy, but we had someone who started a vets organization. So they find executive sponsors and promote, gatherings within our company, have executives be sponsors, bring in speakers, and it's just a way for people to find a home as well. So
That's great. So we have two questions, gentleman and the lady at the back there.
Well, I'm Joaquin. I'm from Mexico. I'm a general counsel for a brokerage. For an insurance company in Mexico, and I hope I can explain it correctly. But basically, what I think is that the diversity issue is most of the companies did not really well understand. Because I had the chance to work for a law firm for 4 years in the U.S., and I think I probably was part of that diversity group. From Latin America. So I think that sometimes when you are included as a diversity group, you feel more excluded because, it's like you're part of this group or you're part of this company because you're different, let's say, or you're from some other country or from some other color. So I think, and I agree with most of you, and especially with Nancy, in terms of that it's very important, the person, and not who you are or from where you are. And
so you're saying that by including you in diversity, they were actually pointing out your difference.
Because you're part of a percentage that the company needs to have in terms of complying with the diversity.
So you became part of a quota.
Right. And it's like someone was saying me yesterday, it was the Women's Day, and they said, well, when is the Men's Day?
364 of the other days of the year.
So that's my thinking. You need to focus on the person and not on where you are or from where you are or what color you are.
Okay, I've just got a lady at the back there and then you, ma'am.
Okay, I'm from India. And in India, we don't have any compliance on diversity and inclusion as of now. I belong to Tata Group of companies. And Tata Group is known for their values and their ethics for a long time. They're existing for more than 100 years. Now, what I want to know from the panel here is whether it is a role. I have two questions. Whether, what we are driving in India is diversity and inclusion, which is a part of the HR. The HR is leading, the human resources is leading that, because as we don't have a compliance and there's no role of compliance or general counsel there. So we are promoting diversity. Number two, I want to know, are we compromising on quality when we talk of gender and diversity? In terms of maintaining that the gender and diversity, are we cornered or are we doing that? I don't know, because I'm coming from a continent where we are practicing this voluntarily. We are not in the framework of compliance. So I just want to know from you.
So I think the question was, are you, by focusing too much on diversity, compromising quality by trying to hit quota targets?
I would say no, not in ACC's case, because when we cast the net a lot more broadly, we saw a lot more talented people. So, and I would say if I compare how we hired in the standards before, when we tend to hire who we know, versus the standards that we've been able to achieve by casting a broader net, the quality of our new hires is substantially leaps and bounds stronger than it had been with the old practices. And that's because people were really competing for the roles. And we had so many applicants from all over that you really had a chance to, choose top talent.
Sam?
I was just going to say to Vita's point, it really is opening up the playing field. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm looking on an individual basis. I need to put a black person there. I need to put an Asian person there. Right. I need to put a woman there. It's casting the bigger net. One of the things at Porsche Cars North America, all of our management level employees and above go through a psychological assessment and an IQ test. And so Porsche is very big on performance, and they want the best and the brightest. And that IQ test is really a kind of a big deal. So the question is, do we get enough people even in to get assessed? Because what you may find is some of those more diverse candidates do better on those. So all we're trying to do is make sure that we give opportunity, and then whoever performs, and we give the job to the best candidate. So I think for us, when we looked at diversity and targets related to our new community and things like that, we didn't look at them on an absolute basis. We looked at them as guidelines. Like, generally, our workforce should reflect our community, but we're not looking at numbers. I need 2 more black people here. I need 2 more women here. That's not what we're doing. What we're trying to say is let's expand.
Yeah, that's exactly how it was at ACC. For example, old ACC probably never thought when we wanted an appellate litigator, we could get a Supreme Court clerk. Old ACC wouldn't even have thought that we could reach that high. New ACC, casting that broadly, we have someone who, clerked for a U.S. Supreme Court judge and spent 16 years at Sherman and Sterling, who now writes our briefs. And it's because we decided we wanted something different. We wanted to cast our net very broadly and then choose the best. So we've been able to achieve greater diversity without any compromise in quality.
And I'd just like to go back.
Between HR and the compliance on that case.
Well, with HR, I'll say the old HR person wasn't on board. Fortunately, she's not with our current team any longer. Her approach was when I would say to her, we need people who have more of a global perspective. By that I mean not just someone who graduated from college here in the U.S. and comes to work at ACC. We need people who have been born and educated and and bring language diversity to our associations so that we can connect better with our members outside of all over the world. Our former HR person would complain, because it took a lot more effort, but she needed to get replaced